from Washington, D.C., Mr. Phil Robertson. Thank you so much for coming, making your time to be on our program today. Appreciate that.
Yes, of course. Happy to join you. And good evening from Bangkok.
Thank you. Welcome to our program today. As you know, Phil, Cambodia has had a new, more democratic form of constitution for 27 years, following the internationally brokered peace deal, the well-referenced 1991 Paris Peace Accord that led to the UN-supervised election in 1993. With the new constitution, the supreme law of the land in place, the Khmer people would hope to see a democratic government upholding democratic principles and values. My first question to you, sir, after more than a quarter of a century, can you say the Constitution has been violated or hijacked by the ruling elite to cling to power?
Well, what we can say very clearly is that Cambodia's democracy, which was supposed to be a rights-respecting multi-party democracy, as promised in the Paris Peace Accords, as agreed to by the international community, has been perverted by Prime Minister Hun Sen and the Cambodian People's Party. We've gone from a situation where there was an election in 1993 that was presided over by the United Nations. It was the largest UN peacekeeping operations in the world at the time. And actually, Hun Sen lost that election. But then he blackmailed his way into power as the second prime minister. And that is now, fast forward to now, we had a totally corrupt 2018 election where the Cambodian People's Party took all 125 seats in the assembly after dissolving the Cambodian National Rescue Party, the only real opposition party, in a politically manufactured case about a colored revolution that didn't exist. So we've gone from the promise of the Paris Peace Accords for rights and multi-party democracy to a single-party dictatorship enforced by military, police, and power. You know, Cambodia right now is a one-party dictatorship where the CNRP officials, they're either under surveillance or in prison if they're still in the country, or they've fled overseas. Right now we have, as many as 80 to 100 CNRP officials who have fled to Bangkok and are seeking refugee status. That's not a normal situation. We've gone to a country where, the protests in the capital city, Phnom Penh, if you protest, you go to prison. People are going to prison for what they post on Facebook. This is a country where independent media has almost been completely wiped out, including the Cambodia Daily print version, including the Phnom Penh Post, the Radio Free Asia, of course, being shut down, through the FM radio network. All these things have taken information away from the Cambodian people. And the NGOs, the human rights groups and others have been put on an almost impossible situation by an intrusive law on NGOs, which is designed to intimidate people that stand up for the rights of others. So basically Hun Sen has taken what was supposed to be a democracy, supported in a constitution that was written with the support of the international community, and an election which was paid for by the international community, and turned everything to his own ends as a one-party dictatorship where rights abuses are rife and where democracy doesn't appear to be on the horizon.
To everyone's disappointment, as you and I know as
except for Hun Sen and the Cambodian People's Party, they seem to like it just fine.
Right. As well as I do, the Cambodian constitution, despite its many amendments in later years, laid the ground rules for respect for human rights, individual rights, political rights, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, etc. Cambodia turns the opposite direction, as you just mentioned. The same man runs the country with autocratic, repressive style of leadership. From your experience, can you tell us what went wrong in Cambodia?
Well, I really have two words for what went wrong in Cambodia. And those two words are Hun Sen. The reality is that this is someone who was focused on regaining total power. He had total power during the government before the Paris Peace Accords, the PRK government. He never changed his real focus, his overall goal. which was to basically sideline his enemies, either politically or in the cases of a lot of people have been killed over the years, and various political opponents assassinated. So this is a person who is prepared to use any means possible to remove his political enemies and to gain complete control.
Yeah.
And it's taken him 30 years, but that's what he has done. He has basically perverted everything about the Cambodian constitution. It now exists as an empty shell, along with the courts, which were never made independent and are controlled by the Cambodian People's Party. He's passing laws which would resemble something you would see in North Korea.
That's
certainly that state of emergency law is an incredible grant of total authority to him, and all he needs to do is declare a state of emergency. So I fully expect right now, so far Cambodia has done pretty well on the COVID-19 situation, but I know that the economy has been devastated. There's no tourists. Many of the exports are no longer being exported. People are getting hungry. The environmental situation is disastrous with the only partial reversal of the Tonle Sap Lake. So the fisheries are in a dire situation. And if people start getting angry and people start protesting, I fully expect that he will use that state of emergency law to be able to make sure that there's no challenges to authority. He said it was to maintain control during a COVID-19 situation, but really what it was to maximize his power and to put another weapon in his pocket to suppress the Cambodian people.
The world knows that Hun Sen, the everlasting strongman, and his henchmen do to his people. We just can't count all their sins. What does the world need to do to save this poor nation from the hands of such kleptocrats?
Well, look, Cambodia has made international commitments to uphold human rights. If you actually look around the Southeast Asian region, Cambodia is probably the only country that has ratified virtually every single UN human rights treaty and covenant. So the international community actually has to put real pressure on Cambodian government to uphold those commitments. But for far too long, it's just been business as usual. I would argue that the international community needs to treat Cambodia as an international human rights pariah state, just like what was done during military-dominated Burma, during the SLORC and SPDC regimes during the 1990s and early 2000s, when no one would do business in Burma. No one would deal with that government because it was so bad. And that is certainly where Cambodia is going towards. The Cambodian situation is one where, if you look at the human rights situation, it's a complete total downward spiral. I think that the European Union deserves credit for, taking action on the everything but arms trade issues. But they shouldn't have just stopped at 20%. I think they actually should have probably considered having taken more and really made it hurt. The EU is actually on a very solid ground because the grant of benefits under the EBA treaty is based on Cambodia's commitment to follow 27 human rights and labor treaties. And that actual conditionality is put into the EBA. And clearly Cambodia has not done so. But if it's just 20%, what we're seeing is Hun Sen is saying, well, I'm not going to pay any attention to the EU. He says, I'm going to turn to China and do a free trade agreement with China. The reality is that what Cambodia trades with China and what Cambodia trades with the European Union are completely different things. And it's manufactured textiles, luggage, shoes, bicycle parts. Those are the sort of things going to the EU. Whereas, China doesn't need those things. They only want, raw materials and agricultural goods. So, I think that, the EU should have done more. I think that we should also see that top-level officials should be sanctioned by various governments around the world, including the so-called list of dirty dozen police and military men that were featured in a Human Rights Watch report.
A list submitted by your organization.
We released that report, 2 years ago. Nothing has been done to those men. Actually, this next month, we're going to release the Cambodian language version of that report with a new accompanying video so that the Khmer people themselves
can we get a copy of that?
Of course. When When we release that, we will be sending it to everybody.
Okay.
You know, Cambodian people should see what Hun Sen and his henchmen have done over the years. But these things have been hidden. And, you know, unfortunately, those things have been hidden also from the diplomats. I mean, you have diplomats who come to Cambodia, they're there for 3 years or 4 years, and then they go on to another post. You know, so we've had to constantly re-educate diplomats about the history of human rights abuses in Cambodia. And
I'd like to inject real quick that, Phil.
Sure.
Are our diplomats, is our embassy in Phnom Penh aware of all these you just described?
Well, we're continually just speaking to them. We're talking to them about that. We're constantly briefing diplomats. We're constantly asking for them to do more. But the reality is that we're not seeing much action. I mean, certainly we're politely received. Certainly they say that the information is very valuable, and they will send it back to their capitals, and they will follow up. But the reality is that we're not seeing much public comments about the human rights problems in Cambodia. You know, really, we've only really seen a few different governments speak up. You know, I mean, one of the things I would hope that the U.S. government would do, you know, the U.S. government should consider stripping Cambodia of their general system of preferences trade status, because the violations of labor rights are clearly there. You know, as I said, Cambodia needs to be treated as a pariah state, because that is what it is. It has become single-party dictatorship where basic civil and political liberties are not allowed. These freedoms have been extinguished under the boot of a single-party dictatorship led by Hun Sen.
What would you say to those who think that tougher sanctions against the regime, the government in Cambodia, would hurt the ordinary people, garment workers, employees? What do you say to that?
Well, I think that what has happened is those people have already been hurt very severely by the Cambodian government. We have seen continuously that they have not, you know, had their rights respected. You know, these actual primarily women who are working in the garment sector, you know, they're hardly making enough money to send anything back to their relatives up country. You know, they're not making very much money at all. And the cost of living continues to go up. You continue to have various different groups of people who are employers who are taking advantage here. You know, we're not really seeing an improvement in the situation of people's lives. You know, I mean, I think this ultimately, many of these jobs, it's about desperation and nothing else being available. The reality is that we have now gotten to a point where the actual, you know, countryside has become so impoverished. People have lost quality access to land. People are indebted to microfinance institutions. You know, they don't have basic infrastructure projects for agriculture. Because the money has gone somewhere else. It's been siphoned off by the Cambodian People's Party. You know, this is a situation that's a big problem.
Yeah. Okay. That's my next question. What can human rights advocates or organizations such as Human Rights Watch do in addition to condemning the government for its human rights abuses? What else can you do?
We continue to speak out. We continue to do research about the human rights problems. You know, and we will continue to do that. But really, it's governments and UN agencies that need to take action. These are the people with influence and power that can somehow act to affect change in Cambodia. And this is the difficulty, getting governments to act. So far, Sweden took a very brave step to phase out the government-to-government assistance and stop supporting the repressive Cambodian government, but none of the other governments have really followed suit. You know, and we see Sweden speak up. We see sometimes that the U.S. says something. You know, the U.S. spokesperson from the embassy might comment on something. But most of the time, it's radio silence about human rights abuses in Cambodia. I mean, I remember the one time the U.S. ambassador, Patrick Murphy, spoke up about the Kem Sokha trial. And there was a lot of reaction by the government. But that's good. We want the government to react. We want them to hear what people are saying. We want them to face criticism. But the problem is he hasn't spoken out publicly since that. You know, it was just that one time. The reality is that when you speak behind closed doors to the Cambodian government about human rights issues, you know, it doesn't go anywhere. You know, they just see that as part of dealing with what they're going to do. And if that's all that comes, then they're getting away with it.
Yeah.
And we see governments like Germany, like Britain, like Australia and others, they don't say anything publicly. They never say anything publicly. Saying something behind closed doors goes nowhere in Hun Sen's Cambodia. And if we look at Japan is particularly bad. I mean, Japan is playing essentially a Cold War with China, trying to compete for influence. And Japan refuses to talk about human rights, even though when you go to Tokyo, they say we have a human rights respecting foreign policy. The reality is that they don't. Japan is trying to compete with China by throwing money at the Cambodian People's Party and the Cambodian government. It's shameful. A government, a democracy like Japan, which is basically one of the longest term democracies in the Asia region, which played a major role during the Paris Peace Accords and supporting various different things with their dollars, with their financial aid, has now come to this, where they're scared to say anything because they think that if they speak out at all, that the government won't love them the way they love China.
Okay. Speaking of inactions by friendly government, foreign governments, please tell our audience, Phil, as much as you can, why can't democracy-loving, justice-loving nations like the U.S. and the EU do more to end the abusive government in Cambodia? Is it because Cambodia not in the sphere of their national interest?
Well, it's a great question, actually. I mean, we've thought about this quite a bit, about what is going on here and why does this happen. And it seems that Cambodia continues to fall off the list of priorities when it comes to what is happening in Washington, D.C., and also in many of the European capitals. I mean, the exception, of course, has been the action by the European Union on the EBA, which I said at the beginning really was something that they should be praised for, because they really did follow through. They said they were going to do this. They expected Cambodia to negotiate. Cambodia refused to negotiate, so they had to follow through. I've had diplomats in Phnom Penh and also diplomats in Bangkok who are covering Cambodia from Bangkok, that they say it's very hard to get attention of people in their headquarters about Cambodia. So Cambodia has become less of a priority, and I don't know why that is. I mean, I think if they were looking at this quite clearly, they would also realize that the way Cambodia is acting, particularly Cambodia's increasing role as the main proxy for China within Southeast Asia and within ASEAN, is going to ultimately undermine ASEAN solidarity. I think ASEAN, everybody says ASEAN's a very important regional organization. The reality is that the other states don't necessarily trust Cambodia, because they know as soon as whatever happened in the ASEAN meeting is finished, the first thing that's going to happen is the Cambodian diplomats are going to call Beijing and tell them all the inside story about what really happened. This is the role that previously Burma used to play during the military governments, during the SPD and SLORC regimes. Now Cambodia has taken that role. And Cambodia, I think, it's going to have a corrosive effect on ASEAN. So I think that the issues that we're seeing in Cambodia are not just about Cambodia, but are also about a wider regional problem, which is that the solidarity that is needed to deal with some of the major regional issues like the South China Sea is not there, in part because China has undermined that unity through basically buying off Cambodia, buying off Hun Sen, building him big buildings, showering
free
investments
loans, grants,
giving them Belt and Road projects. I mean, these are all things where China has done whatever they realize that Hun Sen is willing to be bought, and China's got the money, and that's what they're doing.
Okay, I keep getting back to the right abuses in Cambodia and the subsequent consequences, ramifications. Diplomatic approaches or dialogues by Western countries don't seem to work in Cambodia. The absence of a serious, strong measure to punish human rights violators in that country allows the culprits to live a life with impunity. And empty threats of economic sanctions just push the country to tilt towards China. What is left to put an end to the gross rights violation in Cambodia?
Well, certainly they are living a life with impunity. I mean, if you look at some of the Instagram accounts, the Facebook accounts of leading CPP officials and their wives and their kids, I mean, they've got so much money that they don't know what to do with it. I mean, you know, the kind of corruption we're seeing with the investments in Cyprus, you know, to get EU passports and the various things that are being bought in London and Paris. It's really astonishing that people have so much money and that they're able to suck so much money out of Cambodia. When they do that, what that means is that more and more people are living on $1, $2, $3 a day. They're being impoverished by the level of corruption and the lack of services the government provides. You know, I think that what we need to see, and what we haven't seen, is we need to see real sanctions. We need to see real punishments. We need to see real public denunciations. And we just don't see that. Why is it that we don't see a Human Rights Council resolution at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva on Cambodia? You know, why is it that, you know, the Dirty Dozen don't face any some sort of consequences for what they have done? You know, when the CPP people take their money to Australia, you know, why are they able to invest and the government doesn't enforce the law there about those investments or, you know, opening up businesses? You know, why is this lawlessness allowed to continue? I mean, I don't think that the threats of economic sanctions have pushed the country towards China. I think that the country was going to go towards China anyways. I mean, this was China basically offering a lot of money and political support to Hun Sen. And, you know, instead of fighting this, what we've had is the various different Western countries saying we need to go along with it. We need to pick our spots or pick our fights and things like that. They basically have allowed it to happen, you know, and they haven't made, you know, Cambodia the kind of pariah state that Burma was back in the 1990s. And I think that's been a problem. I think that's been a failure. And, you know, by that they said, you know, at this point they've gotten to a point where they don't feel like they have any leverage, in part because they pursued a strategy all along that was never going to provide them with any leverage to try to change things. You know, so you have that from the diplomats. I mean, then you also have the same thing from the UN. I mean, you know, we've been trying to get the UN resident coordinator and the UN country team to speak up about the human rights violations in Cambodia. But other than the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which of course talks about human rights all the time, and in some cases UNESCO, which is speaking about press freedom, the UN country directors in Cambodia have been profiles in political cowardice. You know, they just think that they're going to do their development projects, and it doesn't matter if Hun Sen and the CPP are seizing all the land and taking all the resources and ruining the environment and leaving the people with nothing. You know, these UN bureaucrats and the UN country team, you know, they just think that, you know, okay, I'll just do a couple projects for a couple years and I'll get my promotion and go somewhere else. And they need to find the political commitment. They need to remember that there is a human rights upfront framework. This is something that the UN Secretary General has stated, that the UN has to stand for human rights. And because of that, it doesn't mean – that means that they don't get to sit on the sidelines when the human rights situation gets bad in a country. They don't get to hide their head in the sand. And so far, that's what the UN resident coordinator and the UN country team have been doing.
Okay. On September 16, the U.S. imposed sanctions on the Chinese company Tanjian Union Development Group, or UDG, a subsidiary of Van Long Group, both connected to the Communist Party of China, which develops a 99-year concessionary lease $4 billion tourist parks and city in Kok Kong province. What do you think the sanction would do to Hun Sen government? Why not also sanction the government of Phnom Penh altogether in this scheme?
Well, I mean, the reality is that this is all about the U.S.-China Cold War. This is about going after a particular China group.
So Cambodia is not in the picture?
Well, I mean, Cambodia is in the picture, but, you know, the reality is that the government of the United States is going after a Chinese investment and a Chinese-connected company. I mean, I would say that they should include Phnom Penh and the various relevant parts of the Cambodian government that are doing this business as well. I mean, the thing is that these sanctions are aimed at a project that the U.S. thinks Beijing is doing to develop a military base in Cambodia. That's what it's all about.
Okay.
This is all about realpolitik between the United States and China.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is that, of course, Cambodia has lost, a lot of political support in the United States, in part because, they are close to China. But I mean, my view about it is that is not the thing that we should be focused on. We should be focused on how do we get back to the promise of the Paris Peace Accords? How do we get back to the promise of a rights-respecting multi-party democracy? What needs to be done? And I think that, that means arguing for instance, releasing Kem Sokha and dropping the charges. That means for arguing for the restoration of the CNRP. That means for, fighting for the release of all the various different CNRP people that have been imprisoned. These are things that need to be done so that, the Cambodian people themselves can say, look, we don't agree with Hun Sen. We have the right to form a political party. We have a right to associate with each other. We have a right to eat noodles with each other. We have a right to stand up and vote and have our votes counted. And if in fact we vote for someone besides the CPP, that has to be respected. And, it seems to me that these things have been forgotten. And instead that we're talking about a Chinese company. We're talking about something over in Kokong. This is not, Cambodia shouldn't just be a pawn in a U.S.-China Cold War. It has to be seen as a human rights abusing single-party dictatorship where the Cambodian people and many of the representatives who have been elected by the Cambodian people in the past in the CNRP, which won 44%, of the vote in 2017. These people have support in the country, and they deserve to be able to compete politically to lead Cambodia.
Yeah. Do you expect the new U.S. administration, whoever will be the next president, to change its policy on Cambodia from empty talk to real action when dealing with autocrats?
Well, it's pretty clear that Donald Trump doesn't care about human rights. And I think he doesn't really care about Cambodia. I bet he probably doesn't even know where it is. There isn't any sort of Trump investment or Trump tower in Phnom Penh yet. So, I would be surprised if he even knew where Phnom Penh was. The reality is that, the only thing that the Trump White House has cared about as far as Cambodia is whether Cambodia is willing to accept deportation of Cambodian green card holders who got into trouble in the law in the United States. And this is the Cambodians who are being sent back, having grown up in the United States, never lived in Cambodia. All of a sudden they're being plunked back down in Phnom Penh with no support and no assistance, not even in some cases the ability to speak Khmer. So, that's when you talk to the Trump people, all they care about is what matters to the United States. And that was like, let's get these people out of here who are felons who've released from prison.
These unwanted people.
Even though they should be considered as Americans, because the problem was they had their green card and they didn't get their full U.S. citizenship. So because they're green card holders, if they commit a felony after that, the law says that they should be deported. So Trump. If Trump wins re-election, then nothing will change. We may see some more rhetoric about China in Cambodia.
Rhetoric, hot air.
He doesn't care about Cambodia. He doesn't even know about Cambodia.
Okay.
If Biden wins, there we have a hope for a return to what was previously a bipartisan recognition that human rights should play some role in U.S. foreign policy. That we would see some sort of general agreement that the human rights issues in Cambodia need to be talked about. And that would be progress. But whether it goes beyond talk to something more is a question I can't answer.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. My last question, and we have one short question from our listeners and viewers. We have seen a total contrast between how the Cambodian government and the Thai government deal with recent protests, between a bloody crackdown and a patient dialogue. Why are they so different?
Well, First of all, I mean, I hope that they remain different. The situation in Thailand is far from finished, and it still may go wrong. Okay. We're seeing now more charges being brought against the student leaders. But so far, there's been a respect for peaceful public assembly. There's been respect for, in some ways, aspects of freedom of expression. But, Thailand has also had a history of bloody crackdowns. 1973, 1976, 1992, and 2010. These are all cases where the military was used against the people. And it is very possible that may happen again. I would say that, in fact, both Cambodia and Thailand, this current government of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, they borrow bad ideas from each other. So,
okay.
The Cambodians said when they were dissolving the CNRP, they were saying, well, why are you saying this? Why are you complaining? Look at Thailand. Thailand dissolved political parties. And it's true. They've dissolved several political parties of Thaksin Shinawatra and his successors, including his sister, on completely bogus grounds. Yeah. Most recently, they just dissolved the Future Forward Party, again, on completely bogus grounds.
Okay.
More than that, we also see that Cambodia and Thailand have increasingly played a role in pursuing each other's dissidents. So we had the very clear case of Rat Rotmoni, who is a media person who was, helping out Russia Today with a documentary about human trafficking.
Yeah. And
he was seized in front of the Netherlands embassy, taken in front of his wife and his infant son, dragged away, handed over at the border by the Thai government. And then the next day, the Cambodian government handed back a political dissident that Thailand wanted. So there's a sort of underground connection between Thailand and Cambodia where they're working together. We saw the case of Cambodian agents trying to seize a senior CNRP person here, Chamrun Suan, in a 7-Eleven, where these men attacked him with
in the heart of Bangkok.
In the heart of Bangkok, and nothing was done. Fortunately, he was able to fight off his attackers when the batteries for their tasers ran out. That was what actually saved him. They hadn't
it's just mere luck.
Put new batteries in their tasers. And then we also have now the case of the missing Thai Wanchalum Saksit, who disappeared in the center of Phnom Penh. There's CCTV video, there's witnesses, but the Cambodian government says they don't know anything about it, and they can't find anything about it. The reality is that the Cambodian government is covering up what happened to this person. And this is a Thai person who was enforcibly disappeared. We hope he's still alive. We don't know for sure. But it has now become a major issue here. And the denials of the Cambodian government that they don't know anything about it are simply not credible. It just they knew this was happening, and they probably know exactly what happened, and they're just covering it up.
Okay, my last question, Phil. This is from our listener's question. What will the Cambodian situation look like between now and sometime in the future if Hun Sen's son, Hun Manet, Lieutenant General Hun Manet, is able to replace his father's, taking his father's position as prime minister?
Well, I think that it's a while to go before that. I think Hun Sen is not planning to leave until his health actually gets bad. And despite various rumors about his health, so far he seems to be pretty strong and not going away anytime soon.
Sure.
The big issue becomes whether the promotion of Hun Manet as prime minister would offend other factions of the Cambodian People's Party. Would there be resistance to him taking over from other people in the party who feel that they were being passed over or felt that they should have a chance to be the senior person? And it's unclear to me whether there is such factional infighting within the CPP or not. But the reality is also, it's very important that people understand, that the senior people at the CPP, many of their sons and daughters, have all intermarried. So it's becoming like an interlocking directorate. This is like a looting party. This is a permanent elite group of people who, you know, are all working with each other. They're all intermarried. They're doing business together. They're doing corruption together. You know, they're repressing people. They're supporting the CPP. So, you know, a lot of people would probably say that there's not going to be resistance to Hun Manet taking over, because you know, if the Huns or the senior family in the CPP, they would then continue to be the leaders. You know, it also goes to the point. You know, I mean, oftentimes we see that the son is not equal to the capacity or the knowledge, the abilities of the father. And we just don't know what sort of leader Hun Manet might be. But I expect that there would still be...
Well, he's U.S. trained.
There would be repressive machinery. There would be continued rights abuses if people tried to take over. If people tried to take over, then it would be, you know, I mean, he would resist the same way his father would.
Right. Okay. Phil Robertson, Deputy Asia Director for Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you for making your time to come to on our program. And I hope to be able to speak with you at some point.
Calling.
Sure.
It's been great to speak with you all.
All right, Phil, and good night to you.
Good night. Thank you.